Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International Lit Fest, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comments section of the platform you are viewing from. An investigative journalist worth their salt must have a nose for the truth. Much like the cobra, they silently stalk through the undergrowth, tracking their prey, striking at the most opportune moment. Giving us some insight into this world, today we have with us Aniruddha Bahal, founder and editor-in-chief of Cobra Post, a non-profit news website that has pulled the mask off of several financial and media scandals. Mr. Bahal will be talking to us today about investigative journalism and his latest book, A Taste for Trouble, Memories from Another Time. And now, The Fangs of the Cobra, a straight talk by Aniruddha Bahal.
Hello, everybody. Hello, welcome. I'm glad that some of you took the time out to come and sort of join the virtual world and see us, hear us speak. I was thinking what to speak about investigative journalism, and I think if I just take you through my own journey, that would encapsulate in many ways the sort of arc of investigative journalism, say over the last 2 decades or something like that, a little more than that. I started my career in India Today, and thereafter I joined a small science and environmental magazine called Down to Earth, which is where my journey really started. Down to Earth at that time was fortnightly, I mean, a monthly, and it gave us a lot of time to pursue stories. I'm talking about mid 90s, and I like 94 to be precise. And we were on these, these state of India's environment reports, etc. And I would go for months to Himachal or Gujarat or Maharashtra, tracking down some really, complex stories, which is what first gave me the taste of investigative journalism. And one of the stories we did at that time was how industrial estates in Gujarat, I mean, in Vapi, Surat, etc., were not treating their effluents. I mean, the chemical industries were not treating their effluents, and which led us to investigating the cost structure of treating effluents and why they were not doing so, etc., etc. And it sort of gave me a taste of, I started enjoying what I was doing. Subsequently, in Delhi, there was a big public sector company which was just disposing its waste in a landfill next to a water body, which they were not supposed to do. And it was gypsum waste contaminated with a lot of chemicals. And I remember going there in a car and picking up a lot of those chemicals, keeping it in the boot, and coming back to office and getting it chemically analyzed, etc., etc. And so it sort of first placed as a young reporter, which was hardly say about 3-4 years in the business. I got a taste that there's something beyond sort of there is something to journalism which I really enjoy. And investigative journalism is nothing. I mean, even a profile can be investigative if you give a lot of time and depth to any of your characters that you're exploring as a profile. Subsequently, of course, Outlook magazine started in 1995, and I became part of the starting team of Outlook magazine. At that time, Vinod Mehta used to be our editor, and he used to give a free rein to his reporters to pursue all manners of stories. I mean, it was a reporter-driven organization. And in 97, I was in South Africa covering the Indian team's one-day cricket series, and I then bumped upon a sort of leads into match fixing in cricket. It first started off as being new to the press box and hearing conversations of other reporters, and some of those reporters were actually talking with bookies from the press box um, itself on the cricket ground, and continuing talking to bookies while the match was going on, giving them live updates and perhaps taking bets. And so that was not on. And And that is what started me off on match fixing, in-depth sort of investigation, which led to us meeting with Manoj Prabhakar, and Manoj Prabhakar saying that an Indian team had offered him money to throw a match. And subsequently, there were several stories of match fixing that I broke in Outlook magazine, which was the genesis. At that time, nobody knew there was match fixing in cricket, and we sort of broke the story of the Pakistani cricket board's investigating the judicial inquiry that they had, Justice Qayyum report into match fixing in Pakistan Cricket Board. Subsequently, there were the Rashid Latif revelations about how Indian players used to be calling him up for information about the weather and the team composition for matches for which they should have had no concern at all. So this all happened in 97, and of course, 98 was the Justice Qayyum report, and there were several other match fixing stories that came on, and in 2000, of course, I ended up starting Tehelka. I was a co-founder of Tehelka along with my partner Tarun Tejpal, and we started Tehelka. And at that point of time, we took the match fixing story forward. I mean, in April of 2000, if you remember, if some of you are history buffs and cricket buffs in particular, there was a whole Hansi Cronier revelations that happened about how Hansi Cronier was caught talking to bookies and was on tape of the Delhi police, and there was this whole bunch of tapes, etc., which led to Hansi Cronier resigning from the game, retiring from the game, and subsequently, of course, the tragic incident of unlinked, of course, of his dying in a aircraft sort of crash. But at that time, because of all those revelations, the CBI had already got into a match fixing inquiry, and they ended up naming a few Indian players, and our own investigation into match fixing came out at that point of time, which created a big noise, so to speak. Our investigation was primarily Manoj Prabhakar accusing Kapil Dev of having offered him money to throw a particular match, etc., etc., and how Manoj Prabhakar had talked to certain players around that time about that. And so it subsequently sort of around that time was one of the few last exposes of match fixing in cricket. But of course, then we started off on our own journey in Tehelka, which was we started using hidden camera for some big story, and Operation West End that we first did. We did that story in 2001 March, and of course, it took us nearly 9 to 10 months to investigate that story. And it was primarily a story about how there was corruption in the defense procurement process in the Indian system. And we sort of pretended to be arms dealers peddling a non-existent product. In this case, it happened to be night vision thermal binoculars, and which we made some fancy catalog of night vision thermal binoculars, and how they had like 5th generation and 4th generation systems and so on and so forth. And we set up a fictitious non-existent company, and we went through the system trying to sell that, and we ultimately succeeded in sort of getting a trial and evaluation sort of decree that our product should be trial and evaluated. And of course, we had no product to submit. And we ended up meeting army personnel, defense middlemen, politicians, all with the view to promote our non-existent product. And the conversations that we had with them were very revealing. It told us how, it sort of encapsulated for us how the system worked. And of course, it led to those famous incidents and events with the president of then president of the BJP party, Bangaru Lakshman, who took money from us for promoting our product. It led to us having a meeting with J.R. Jaitley, who was then president of the Samta party. And that meeting itself was in the then Defense Minister George Fernandez's house. So it led to a big furore. It led to an inquiry commission by ex-Supreme Court Judge Justice Venkat Swamy. And it led to sort of inquiry that lasted many years. And me and my colleagues ended up giving sort of evidence over many months. I mean, I was cross-examined on that story for nearly by about 40 lawyers for nearly 2 months. And it was the first instance in Indian media history after independence that a story was so closely examined, it was laid threadbare, and of course, the then NDA government was not really kosher in the sense that they really didn't want the truth to come out. And they, in the terms of reference of the inquiry, was a very insidious terms of reference. There were 4 terms of reference, and the last one was investigating Tehelka itself in the manner in which they had brought out the story, and that was just a means to put the media house on the back foot. And it turned out more an inquiry into Tehelka than the revelations that Tehelka brought forth. But I'm happy to say that the story held, the tapes were declared genuine. And of course, it went on. The government then started using other tactics to scare us. They instituted an official secret acts case against us. They picked up one of our reporters on a fictitious poaching charge, etc., just to put the media organization on the back foot and to malign us. And for the first time, as a reporter, I was hardly 10 years into the reporting business, and I came to see firsthand how a state could really go after reporters. I mean, please understand that this was the year 2000. I mean, the period was from 2001 till about 2004. And the manner in which the state went after us was a revelation. Through the Justice Venkateswamy Commission, they bogged us down. We were a company which had raised venture funding of nearly $1 million, $1.5 million for a new media venture, which was much talked about. And the second round of funding, we were in the process of raising a second round of funding, but they scared away all our investors who had committed to investing. They scared away advertisers from our sites. So they dried off the funding by scaring off people and setting example of the investor who had first invested in us, Shankar Sharma of First Global. And they really went after First Global. They incarcerated Shankar Sharma, and they wanted to know why we were invested in Tehelka, and they came up with a bogus theory that we had done the story because we wanted to crash the stock markets and we wanted to make money off our prior held positions in the stock market, which is all bogus. Because after the story, the stock markets in fact went up, they didn't fall down, and so that theory fell flat on its face. So it was a series of battles that we had with the state, which was a precursor to NDA 2, actually. I keep telling people now about how the malicious use of the state agencies, whether it was the Enforcement Directorate, whether it was the Income Tax Department, whether it was the CBI, how they were maliciously using the state agencies to go after a media house which had embarrassed and pushed a certain, a picture which was unfavorable and to them. So that whole episode was a sort of trial through fire for a lot of us, me and my partners. And of course, it broke down Tehelka at that time. And I left Tehelka sometime in 2003 and started my own venture, which was Cobra Post. And we ended up doing a series of investigations there, which were much talked about. I mean, one of the first investigations we did with Cobra Post was Operation Duryodhan, which was our investigation into how MPs in the Indian Parliament were taking bribes to ask questions in the Indian Parliament. Please remember that time the Right to Information Act hadn't come in. And the parliamentarians asking questions in the Indian Parliament was the first, in fact, a right to information, because you couldn't deny answering an MP who raised questions in the Indian Parliament, and the whole system had to give answers to that. And so there was our story led to the dismissal of 11 MPs after a series of inquiries by the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. And it was, I mean, the way the story started off was very arbitrary in a way. And there was a Indian television channel which I think in the month of April of 2005 or March, I forget the month, did a story using hidden cameras, which was basically on the casting couch. And I wrote a column in the Hindustan Times in 2005, sometime in March, April, that that wasn't really the right use of hidden camera. And one shouldn't be doing stories like that using hidden camera, because the stories had to be in public interest. And I didn't see much public interest in the way that they had used that hidden camera. It was more voyeurism of a particular kind. I mean, we have largely stuck with our definition of when we can use it in cameras, which is basically there has to be prior information about the inclination of certain people to commit certain acts which are perhaps illegal, unethical, etc., public servants. And also that, it should be in public interest. I mean, that particular story. And nobody's ever accused us of doing a story which was not in public interest. I mean, they might have accused of a lot of other things. So I wrote this column that this was not the way to use hidden cameras, and I got a notice from the Indian Parliament saying that there was a breach of privilege and I should explain myself. And I was really, really taken aback by that notice, and it came from forwarded to us by Somnath Chatterjee on the basis of a privilege motion moved by a MP in the Indian Parliament. And so it motivated us and the team to really prove that this happened, that the MPs, that the whole talk was how MPs took money to ask questions in the Indian Parliament. And we ended up doing that story sometime in December of 2005. And it obviously, there was a lot of, to me, it was a really absurd story that happened in the manner of the kind of questions that were asked in the Indian Parliament. I mean, I was using my writer's imagination and putting all kind of wild questions that the MPs were actually putting on paper and pushing in the Indian parliamentary system as questions to be asked. I'm a big fan of Catch 22 of Joseph Heller. I mean, some of you who are literature buffs might have read the book. It's a novel, and it's a crazy novel, one of the all-time favorite books that I have read on the list. And there's a character there called Yossarian, who's the main character in the book. And so one of the questions was how, when is the Indian Defense Establishment inducting sort of, I'm paraphrasing here, the Yossarian diesel engine? And there's a certain Leopard glue gun, LEP glue gun mentioned in Joseph Heller's book about how there was a glue gun which struck aircrafts in the air. So we ended up asking questions about when were they procuring the Leopard glue gun, etc., etc. And all these questions were actually asked in the Indian Parliament, and we burst out laughing that this is how easy it is to penetrate the system. And subsequently, I mean, it gave us great confidence in launching Cobra Post and doing that story. And the success of Tehelka and then subsequently Cobra Post, as it started off, inspired a lot of television channels to start their own special investigative team. For that, I think the credit goes to Tehelka and Cobra Post. And a lot of these television channels, whether it was Aastak or CNN IBN or Star, then Star News, now IVP News, and some others, who started off their own internal special investigative units, and they had reporters there, but they didn't really sort of get the grasp of how to do stories, investigative stories initially, because there was a tendency, you see, investigative journalism, when you put reporters on stories, the stories take time. So first of all, a value of time has to be there. You have to put reporters long term on stories. You have to spend money on those stories. Reporters have to have a certain degree of talent, and there is luck. So there are these four elements that go in investigative stories: time, money, talent, luck. And if you don't have even one of them, then it usually fails to happen, because you have to have time, which means that your editor in the SIT or his boss have to have the patience to let reporters be, and television channels didn't really have the patience because they would see these reporters roaming around and they would think that they're doing nothing, and they would then put them on routine reporting. And once you put these reporters on routine reporting, they're not going to deliver investigative stories for you because they don't have the time and space and the time to develop contact, the time to develop story ideas. And a lot of these story ideas go waste because not all investigative stories really come through. I mean, you end up chasing maybe 10 stories, and out of this, maybe 2 come through. So there's a big sort of fall through of ideas that happens, but you end up spending money on those ideas. So as the arc went, we ended up doing a lot of stories in Cobra Post, whether it was the Ranveer Sena killing Dalits, whether it was the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, about how the conspiracy behind the movement, whether it was the 84 Delhi riots. We had commissioned programs from different television channels. For the first channel that commissioned us to do investigative programs was Star News. And then, of course, CNN IBN also commissioned us for a long time to do investigative programs for that. The parliamentarian story that I talked about was in partnership with the Aastak television station. And we sort of at different points of time contracted with different television channels to do stories for them. And a lot of those stories were using hidden cameras. The reason for that was, I mean, we did a lot of RTI-based stories, we did a lot of document-based stories, but a significant chunk of our stories were also hidden camera-driven because the nature of those stories demanded that the burden of proof was very high. If you're accusing a minister or an MP of a particular, if he's doing an act or a crime, your burden of proof really is high. You have to really, the courts come down on you, investigative agencies come down on you, and then if you don't have proof, then you are, up the river without a paddle. So the burden of proof meant that the video became important, and the video as a byproduct became a product for television channels. So your evidence became a sort of product that the television channels could use. So that was a circular sort of a fulfilling mechanism that started happening, and which is why television channels in India picked up a lot of hidden camera stories at that point of time. I mean, we started this culture. Of course, a lot of them didn't end up using hidden cameras in the right way. I mean, that's a separate story in itself. But moving on, we went into cycles of great stories, and then a lot of our stories led to big impacts. I mean, I've already talked about Operation West End, how it led to the resignation of the then president of the BJP, Bangaru Lakshman, how it led to the resignation of the then Defense Minister, George Fernandez, how it led into a whole series of overhaul of defense procurement, the laws concerning defense procurement. It was the first time that they declared that lobbyists had to, defense middlemen had to register themselves in the Indian ministry and so on and so forth. So all those things happened. In 2013, we did a story about investigation about how Indian banks, both private and government, nearly 36 of them, were indulging in money laundering, which is to say that they had, they were willing to take money in cash. They were willing to do any kind of thing to sort of please their client and introduce dodgy money into the system. And when we broke that story, it led to an investigation by the RBI itself. And the RBI, for the first time in its history, ended up fining banks 5 crores, 2 crores, etc. The fine amounts were so huge, where earlier it used to be just 2 lakhs, 3 lakhs, just token sort of rap on the knuckles. But this time, the quantum of fees, and it led to a big overhaul in your KYC of clients. I started getting a lot of calls from my colleagues blaming me for making this KYC process so arduous that they had to spend so much time with the banks. It led to an overhaul of how the banks could sell you insurance. So it was a big impact story that we did. We also did a story about Operation Falcon Claw, which was how MPs were using their offices to lobby for big companies. And that story, and then there was these. We did a RTI-based story about how politicians, whom were they traveling with in air charter flights. I mean, it took us many months to do the story, file RTIs in different airports with the Director General of Civil Aviation to find out the passenger manifests of people. So a lot of these stories take time. They take you have to develop particular talent to develop these stories, and once they come out, it's a big sort of fulfilling and satisfying mental emotion that takes place, and you feel that you're doing something good. I always felt that investigative journalism was like a dose of penicillin into the system, and you need these doses of penicillin all the time. I mean, just to give you a sort of a perspective, we became non-profit sometime in 2013 because I sort of took the call that it's not really possible to do investigative journalism anywhere on a for-profit basis. I mean, my contracts with different television channels just allowed us to survive. It didn't really make us an institution which could do stories on and on a regular basis. So we turned non-profit in 2013, and it has been a very checkered history since then in the sense of resources. And but what moves us is a lot of public sympathy and public sort of appreciation of the work that we do. In fact, I remember a story sometime in 2001 after we broke Operation West End, because at that time, if you remember 2001, television had just about started penetrating in the Indian household in a big way. And for the first time, the Indian public was seeing images of corruption of politicians, which had never happened before. And it was like a seismic shock to them that here these politicians, picking up wads of money, especially the Bangaru Lakshman visual. And it really sort of the kind of sympathy that we sort of got at that point of time was unbelievable. In fact, I remember a friend of mine from Bangalore telling me this story of maybe a week or 10 days after the story broke, was how she was traveling the streets of Bangalore and she overheard two Kannada women talking amongst themselves. And one woman remarked to the other that, that Tehelka was this electronic device that they have made in Delhi. And if you stood in front of this device, it would tell you the amount of corruption you have done in your life. So it was these kind of stories that sustained us, that said that, okay, I mean, that kind of story was really, I've told that story, hundreds of times to people. There was also the story of one of our reporters traveling in a bus in Delhi. And there was a dispute between a passenger and the conductor about the fare, the passenger felt that he was being overcharged. And then he got off the bus in a huff and he shouted that I will report you to Tehelka.com. So it was a kind of, public recognition and the kind of high regard that the people generally had, not only for Tehelka, but that's the fact that there was somebody willing to do those stories, somebody willing. And I must tell you that these days, if I come to now, from then to now, there has been a sea change. At least during that time, there was the thirst in mainstream media to do investigative stories. There was a thirst in media platforms that investigative stories are something that needed to be done, that a democracy needs them. The reporters wanted to do them. Now there is no ambition in mainstream media to pursue investigative stories for many years now, and they feel as if they would be on the wrong side of the state if they did them. They are not willing to take on the state. They are not willing to sort of take on the trouble that comes from taking on the state. And I won't bring the media alone, because there is a sense also that the courts perhaps might not have their back if they ended up doing investigative stories. So that is another sort of big thing that sort of holds back journalists from doing those kind of stories. And cutting to a lot short, so there is, keep meeting a lot of youngsters who want to join journalism, and I don't discourage them, but I said that, look, if you want to join this profession, for the glamour of it, then don't join it. Because a lot of these youngsters in media institute would say that they want to be television anchors, and they were so taken up by the glamour of the whole thing that they wanted to be sort of seen on television, be recognized, and so on. But that's not really the profession. Is there's a lot of hard work in the profession. As an investigative journalist, you really have to cross your T's. You have to know the who, where, what, why, how, and it's a fulfilling profession. But whether it's the right time now for a lot of you to take that, I don't know, honestly. I mean, as a journalist, but if you persevere, it's a profession that really, really satisfies. I hope I've spoken a lot, and if there are any questions that people want to ask me, they are welcome to ask those questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bahal. That is quite a journey and certainly not for the faint-hearted. Time, money, talent, luck, that's something I've picked up and I'm sure our viewers have picked up as well. We have quite a few questions coming in. The first one is from Zara. What gives you the courage and determination to carry on in the field of investigative journalism?
You see, once you are chasing stories, it's a very unique feeling, and getting a story right and doing an investigative story and breaking it, it's a really experience cannot be described if you are really not an investigative journalist yourself. So that drive is very essential, the drive to expose, the drive to get it right, the drive to do a great story. And if that drive is no longer there in a journalist, you should stop being a journalist. That is what I've always advised journalists. That drive and the thirst to get the next big story is very, very important.
Absolutely. Like you said, it's not just a glamorous career. You must have the drive. Thank you so much. Our next question is from Atharva. Does being an urban, high-profile journalist offer some level of protection that might be lacking for brave journalists in small towns and rural areas?
Of course, you're very right. I mean, in Delhi, not now, but earlier, I could presume that in the metropolitan cities of India, there was a degree of protection from the high courts, like in Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, etc. In Mofussil areas, that protection is not there because you're exposed to the venality of the local administration, and it could be coming from the police, it could be coming from the magistrates, and there's not really media attention, too much focus on it, and from the lack of that, it becomes a really it might spiral up quickly into a frightening scenario for the local journalists, and it has happened multiple times. I mean, actually not dozens, hundreds of times in Mofussil areas. I mean, look also recently about how the Tripura government is misusing its powers. So, in a sense, things can spiral off, and that's why we just start a few organizations like Foundation for Media Professionals, where we could sort of pick up some of these issues and highlight them, issue statements about them, etc., etc. But a lot more needs to be done.
Definitely. Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Mohit. With the reputation of the media has today, how much can investigative journalism be allowed to function freely and independently? It's an excellent question.
You see, reputation is always up and down. If you look at the US right now, journalists have never had the kind of, low sort of faith from the public than now. But look at the great investigative journalism that has continued to happen in the Trump period, and even now, they stood up as an establishment. They ended up doing a lot of investigative stories. I mean, hundreds of them. In North America, there are nearly 150 investigative non-profits. In India, maybe there is a clutch of 6. So there's no comparison of the number. And foundations, universities, think tanks are devoted to investigative journalism. The Center for Public Integrity, Mother Jones, I mean, you name it, there's a whole bunch of them. India needs more investigative non-profits. You see, it's a cycle, but if you want to continue as a democracy, if you want to have a nation of rule of law, then you have to investigate, you have to invest in investigative journalism, whether it is mainstream media on a commercial basis, whether it is a non-profit basis. There is no getting away from whistleblowing, and that whistleblowing happens from trained journalists. So if you think that by denouncing media and in this out cycle by pointing fingers at some media platforms who are not doing their job and tainting everybody else with that, won't really work for our democracy, because a democracy needs exposure, a democracy needs light in dark areas, a democracy needs people to sort of know what has been happening with public money.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Karan. Do you think there is sufficient training given to journalists who want to investigate? It requires more skills than just following your nose or gut instinct.
You see, you cannot, a journalist can pick up some tools which help him investigate better, but ultimately it has to come from inside. I mean, the instinct to chase a story can't really be taught, but there are a lot of tools out there now which we didn't have. Everything has gone digital. In our early days, when we were doing investigation, there was nothing. Google wasn't there. Your basic sort of research point wasn't there. We used to go in libraries, looking up clippings and sort of putting together the research for a story. These days, it's unbelievable how much you are aided. If you are tracking down there is databases there where you could track down the cargo, which ship is carrying what cargo. There is data out there. You could track down websites of how MPs have declared, what kind of assets they have declared, and whether they have tried to hide something. It's all available. Those databases are there. You have to investigate those databases. There's Facebook, there's Twitter. You can go to the back and say, there might be some picture there on Facebook, who are the person's friends, and those kind of, there are a lot of tools available. The Global Investigative Journalist Network, which is a very, very body to which Cobra Post also belongs, teaches you all these tools about encryption, about how to search data, how to do crowdsourcing of investigations, how to do global investigations. So there is so much more help to an investigative journalist right now than there ever was. If you want to be solo, there is YouTube. You can put out your stories on YouTube yourself. You can use Facebook. Of course, that's a different, I'm not sort of entering that domain. That could take another day. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there are tools available to a journalist which were not there when we started off. We are using them. So it's much easier to be an investigative journalist if you are in a particular frame of mind and you want to pursue that as a profession.
Right. So we do have the tools available. One must have the courage to use those tools. So just a couple of more questions.
Sure.
The print media space seems to be shrinking in India, especially post-COVID. What implications do you think this has for the press and journalism overall in India? And this question was asked by Tejal.
You see, the print media space, in my opinion, will still grow in India because of the literacy rates. If you know, for the longest time, the West, the print space was dipping, but in India, it was growing at an alarming space because there is a whole, thousands and crores of people who are not literate, and if they are coming to literacy, their first stop at that time used to be newspapers. Of course, now it could be the mobile phone, and they could be taking be reading newspapers on the mobile phone. Their habits and all, the NRS survey should perhaps indicate. But of course, overall, eventually, the bulk of the people would pick up their news digitally from their phones and from maybe media aggregators like Google and Facebook and so on and so forth, Twitter. And so it's a big challenge moving ahead, how to monetize your stories and news. But having said, it's something which is happening right before our eyes, and it has still to play out. There are a lot of digital, even the Times of India has gone digital, it's behind a paywall and you have to pay. The Hindu is doing that, and a lot of other organizations are doing that. So that journey remains to be seen. The New York Times is the most successful example of how making the transition from print to digital. Now the bulk of their revenues come from digital. They have they have millions of subscribers on the net, and perhaps there might come a time, maybe 4 or 5 years down the line, where there is no paper edition anymore and everything is digital.
Right. Thank you, sir. I hope that answers your question, Tejal. Our next question is from Minoti, and she has asked this through Facebook. Journalists sometimes find themselves the accused in police stations and law courts for filing a story. Do you think there should be some legal provision to ensure that this does not happen?
Well, there cannot be a blanket legal provision, and there is a tendency of the state now more so than before of sort of scaring away. I mean, even normal reporting is being criminalized today. I mean, the wire reporters, there's this whole incident in Tripura where 2 reporters went from Bombay, and they were like sort of hounded by the Tripura police, and finally they got bail, etc. And they've been hounding like hundreds of dozens of journalists like that. I mean, it's something that has been happening in UP, Karnataka, everywhere around the country actually. And it is very, very scary that people who are just going to do normal reporting are being hounded by the state like that. I mean, there's no option but to stand up and fight. And, eventually, I mean, the US Constitution and even constitutions of some other countries give protections to a journalist, but our Constitution doesn't. Our Constitution gives us the same protection which is available to any citizen of India under Article 19, freedom of expression. So maybe there is need for a special provision in the Indian Constitution which gives slightly more protection to the Indian journalists. I mean, it certainly would help.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much, sir. I think that's all the questions we have and all the time we have for now. So thank you so much for being with us today and for
Not
this
at all.
wonderful...
I enjoyed. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow, that was really wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Bahal, for this insightful session, and to you, our audience, for being with us and sending in all your wonderful questions. A big thank you to our partners that have made this possible. A Taste for Trouble is available at our bookstore partner Landmark Excite, that is landmarkxcite.com. Tata Literature Live, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej, continues with many more sessions. Do check out our website for the full schedule. Coming up shortly at 11 a.m. IST is Poetry Buffet with Katie Bugley and Medha Rajadyaksha. Have a lovely day ahead.